From overseas battlegrounds to overseeing booze regulations to fighting human trafficking and cleaning up county government, Bentley Nettles has been a busy man. Oh, and he wrote a book, because of course he did. The book captures a leadership philosophy honed over the course of his impressive career as a Brigadier General and JAG officer in the Army, Executive Director of the Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission, TABC, and Brazos County Commissioner. The philosophy? Pretty straightforward. Embrace different perspectives, invest in people, encourage creative problem solving, provide meaningful work, and seek constant feedback. The results? Nothing short of amazing. Bentley was deployed to multiple combat theaters around the world, including Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and earned the Legion of Merit, Bronze Star Medal, and Purple Heart Medal for his service. He reduced permit approval time from 85 to 89 days down to 48 hours at TABC. And while there, he created a system for identifying human traffickers that was so successful it's been replicated in 12 states. He also founded Brazos Family Cares, a nonprofit group dedicated to serving military veterans and their families. My takeaway? It's not just about the philosophy. It's about living it. That's what Bentley Nettles has done, is doing, and will continue to do. We'd all do well to follow his lead. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, rate, review, or subscribe to the podcast. Let the desuckifying begin. Here's Bentley. Okay, Bentley Nettles, welcome to the Desuckify Work podcast.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, happy to have you here. And before we go too deep into anything, I'd love to give you a chance to just introduce yourself, talk a little bit about what you do and how you came to be doing it.
Sure. I'm Bentley Nettles, retired Brigadier General brevet, and wrote a book called Creating Excellence. And so since then, I've run for public office and was elected. And so now I'm a county commissioner in Brazos County, Texas.
Nice. Excellent. How are you enjoying the transition that you've made from military life to civilian life, but also including local government? How's that all been for you?
Well, every group's a different challenge.
Yeah. What's been the biggest adjustment so far since you've left the military?
Well, I think the commonality. Even on the joint force, you have different military cultures, but we're all pulling in the same direction. In the civilian world, that's not always the same. And in the political world, it's even more challenging.
I can imagine. Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to dive into some of that stuff. Before we dive in, I want to just ask you a question I've asked some others, which is, what role does work play in your life?
Well, I think it's a big part of who you are, right?
Yeah.
You have to have a balance between work life and other things that are important, but it defines your life. I mean, your life's work is what it is. So how you define that or how it defines you ends up setting, the parameters of your life, whether it's good, bad, or otherwise.
Yeah. When you entered the military, was it at that point in time in your life, did it feel like life's work, or was it a different experience at that point?
No. To be honest, I wasn't planning on staying. So I was going to do my first contract term and get out. And then I decided I liked it. So
what'd you like about it? What kind of grabbed you?
The adventure, the things that you get paid to do that you'd have to pay to do anywhere else, flying helicopters, jumping out of them, flying in airplanes, going to different parts of the world, and really the challenge of leading small teams.
Yeah. So was there anyone kind of along the way that helped you really open your eyes to all of that? Was there a leader who helped you kind of see just how much possibility there was there?
Well, I'd say every single one of them
Yeah.
helped. I never, whether directly or indirectly, they all challenged me to look at things different and be better.
Mm. And what did being better mean for you?
Well, achieving the next school, achieving the next command, um, being a better focused on serving the people that were in your unit.
Hmm. Yeah. Were there times where you wanted to give up?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Lots of times, life in itself can be challenging, and you
Yeah.
think, why am I here? And
Hmm.
so you have to get perspective on it, and and the real challenge is, like I talk about in my book, is that being a type A personality tend to be focused on goals and objectives. But
Hmm.
or to be a leader, those goals and objectives have to transform to being for other people.
Mm. How how do you make that transformation? I mean, it's so ingrained in us to achieve the things that are on our plate, right? And then to see through the lens of helping others achieve what they need to achieve. What helped you make that shift?
Well, I think when you get to a point where the goals and objectives are no longer achievable by your efforts,
Mm,
it can only be achievable by a group effort or an organization's efforts.
yeah. Mm. What was the biggest difference that you've seen from leading in the military to leading outside of the military?
I think the perspective that people have about the military, they think that, you give an order and people just go do it. And that's not
Yeah.
always,
Yeah.
especially if you're on a staff, you have to coordinate with other peers and convince other people that that's the direction that the organization should go.
Hmm.
So it's the reality of the military tends to be very different than how civilians perceive it.
I can imagine that. I think, we get our I've not been in the military. We get a lot of our information about the military from two places, right? It's the news and it's movies,
Right.
right? And I have to imagine both of those are tinted with untruths at times. What what did you learn leading in the military that you feel was most valuable carrying into the civilian life?
Persistence, it's not like a 30-minute home improvement show. There really are challenges, and you have to
Yeah.
work through the challenges, and whether they're a problem or people, and being persistent and investing in people will usually render positive results. And you know fairly quickly if you're not moving in the right direction.
Mm. What does investing in people in the military look like? Meaning, I think structurally it feels different than a corporation, but maybe it's not. Like if you're like looking to put more investment into folks on your team in the military, what do you do? How do you get that to happen?
Well, so you go through them with their goals and objectives, and you help define their future. You
Hmm.
make sure they go to the school so they can attain that future and get the skills and training they need to move to the next level.
Mm.
And you also have to realize next level may not be within your unit. It may be with another opportunity at a higher command.
Hmm.
So you're always developing people. Sometimes you're losing them when you develop them, but that's still the right thing to do.
Yeah. Mm. So one thing that I think has been kind of a, a hot topic these days, and I'm curious to get your perspective on it because you've got both the experience sort of within the government, but at the military level, but now you're working in local government, which is probably its own kind of beast. But this idea of government efficiency has been like top of mind here over the last few months, and I think everybody has a different perspective on it. I'm curious if your experience, either in the military or now working as a local county commissioner, like, what are the best lessons you've learned about how to be more efficient in those spaces?
Well, I think it's one of perspective, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes people in the government lose the perspective of their customer.
Mm.
And that becomes a real challenge. One of the things we did at the Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission was we knew coming out of COVID that we're going to be dealing with business owners who are, really challenged. They're frustrated. You're the regulator, so try to be empathetic, and try to work with them to get their lives back on track.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually sent a couple of our training folks to the Disney Customer of Excellence training program, and then we took
Wow.
some of that and adopted it for our agency because, if you lose the perspective of the customer,
Mm-hmm.
you're just another bureaucracy that they
Yeah.
have to deal with. You're not helping them.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's my challenge in county government is, we count things, right? So what are we counting and how are we achieving those things?
Mm-hmm.
If you're not counting something, you're telling me the best of your business. Well, how do you know?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that seems, I mean, it's an interesting challenge to keep an eye on the customer, right? And what's interesting, having worked in larger corporations at times, you can lose it there too, for sure. You're so removed. I find when you're in smaller companies, it's a little easier because it's right in your face all day long, right? But in government, it's a different beast, right? The customer, the people. Other than when they vote in new politicians and things like that, they're not as maybe visible at times, or not as, like, they don't necessarily have a choice, right? I have to work with my county because that's my county, or
Right.
So how do you, in the midst of that and that truth, how do you help folks still keep their eye on that customer focus?
Well, I think you go back to what are you counting?
Mm.
So if you're and are you getting feedback from your customers? Are you soliciting it? Are you giving
Mhm.
them a survey so
Yeah.
you know what they're feeling about their experience with your particular department?
Mm-hmm.
That's important because you might be the best at doing what you do, but if
Mm-hmm.
you're alienating your customers and doing it, then you're not really doing the job that you should be doing.
Yeah. Mm. I feel like there's a perception, and whether this is true, you might have a perspective on this, like that folks who work in the government, because they're somewhat removed, maybe don't care as much about what the customer thinks. So even if you're getting that input, that there's a sense like, well, it doesn't really impact me because I'm already here. Um, do you notice that ever? And if you do, how do you counter that to help people really connect to what you just talked about?
Well, I think the challenge is just that tying customer experience, customer satisfaction with accountability,
Mm-hmm.
pick your department.
Yeah.
And, if you're best at doing whatever it is you do, how, if you're not really the best, if the experience your customers are left with is something less than desirable,
Yeah.
right? I mean, if people dread going down to pay their um, renewing their licenses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then that's a problem.
Yeah.
And you'll eventually hear about it from people you're accountable to. If you're a state agency, then they're going to complain to their representative, and he's going to, contact you, and so it trickles downhill. The
Mm.
same way with almost every organization. If you make someone dissatisfied enough, they'll reach out to the boss, the CEO, and send them an email
Yeah.
because they've tried to work through the problem and you're not helping them work through it. You're just throwing up obstacles.
Mm. That's an interesting point. I mean, you talked about sending emails, and now with social media, online reviews, all this kind of stuff, it's so much easier to make noise about stuff that's not working, that it's maybe harder to ignore, I would imagine.
I think so. And that I see that as a good thing, quite
Yeah.
frankly.
Yeah.
The challenge is sometimes on social media, people spread disinformation. You
Yeah.
know, you blame a department because they couldn't help you with something, even though the department said, well, this isn't our role. You need to go over and talk to these people.
Hmm.
They can help you. We can't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can imagine that would be frustrating. Um, I wanted to touch on one thing that you've done that's connected, I imagine, to your military experience is that you've created um, I think you co-created an organization called Brazos Valley Cares, which supports veterans issues. And I'm curious, like, we haven't had a great history around how we treat veterans, how we support veterans. I mean, certainly sort of post Vietnam on, there's been a lot of failure in that space. How do you feel we're doing right now, and how is your organization that you co-founded helping where it's needed?
Well, for one thing, it's survived. It's over 11 years old, which is a strong um, statement for the need of the organization, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
continued. When we originally started it, it was in between deployments for me. I had one of my classmates from A&M who was the surgeon for the 75th Infantry Regiment, and
Mm-hmm.
his guys were coming in to San Antonio, and like a lot of young guys, they'd have 2 or 3 appointments a week and nothing else to do the rest of their time. And so the problem is with young soldiers, airmen, Marine, they tend to get in trouble if you give
Mm-hmm.
them too much free time.
Yeah.
So they literally started an organization there that was built on um, the federal installation, but through private funds, about $500 a piece. They built a center for the families to come down and visit with them, and there was meals there every day for them, all donated.
Mm-hmm.
There was even ways for them to talk to their unit back in theater.
Mm.
So incredible achievement. But from that achievement, we started Brazos Valley Cares to also support that organization.
Yeah.
As the war ended, that organization has not been as active because they don't have as many injured soldiers and airmen coming into San Antonio.
Mm-hmm.
We're focusing on um, veterans here in Brazos County. Now, A&M has a lot of veterans that come here to go to school, and that transition from military life to civilian life or to a student can sometimes be very hard
Yeah.
on veterans. And so that organization helps them through that. Some things are as simple as you still there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Just disappeared off my screen.
Okay.
So some things are simple as, you know, their GI Bill only pays them when they're in school. So if they have a gap between semesters and they have a family, suddenly that income source that they were living on and surviving on just disappears.
Mm.
So the first time it's a surprise and the organization can help them. And usually they won't have it happen a second time.
Right.
So it's things like that
Mm-hmm.
that really was useful. I think they're up to they've given away about $100,000 a year.
Mm-hmm.
These kind of emergency situations. So
Mm. Wow. That's really cool. Um, you talked a bit earlier about, one of the distinctions coming out of the military can be that there's a more clearly shared mission in that space than when you get into civilian world or even in the government and political world. So, and I know in your book you talk about the importance of that shared mission. So when it's not as obvious, how do you help people see it or even discover it?
well, I think that's part of the first 90 days of assessing an organization is going around and talking to people, really understanding what the challenges from their perspective is or their position to
Mm.
deliver those kind of services.
Yeah.
And then start trying to visualize what does excellence look like for that organization and the providing of the services or products.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you do that, you have to figure out how do you articulate that to your managers so that you're all on the same sheet of music, right?
Mm-hmm.
Start creating that shared vision. But really, until you understand the challenges of either producing the product or delivering the services,
Mm-hmm.
don't really understand how to help get to excellence for the organization.
Mm. So what, I can imagine you walk into some places and honestly, people don't know some of these things, meaning there's confusion around what excellence even looks like or what, the goal of the organization is. Is it, is part of that process in that first 90 days, digging in enough so that people can start to, think beyond kind of the job that's in front of them, which is like such a macro version of something, and you're not really seeing the big picture. So is it giving them permission to kind of go, how do you think the work you do ladders up to something bigger? Is that part of it? And what tends to open people's eyes to the fact that their work does actually serve something bigger and ultimately is striving for that excellence that you're talking about?
Well, I think you're right. I think you do have to identify what is the big picture. What are you trying to do?
Mm-hmm.
So, and a lot of it is, what if it were you on the other side of the desk?
Mm.
What would you want to walk away with from that
Mm-hmm.
experience?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other is, how does whatever you're doing support people's, happiness,
Mm-hmm.
right? For the county, people ask, well, what does the county commissioner do? Well, in my opinion, county commissioner helps maintain the quality of life for the residents in our county. And you
Mm-hmm.
do so by accomplishing three things. One is public safety,
Mm-hmm.
making sure that people aren't afraid to go out and be in their community. The second is the ability to move around your county or the community because that impacts your quality of life. And finally, the services that you provide to your residents.
Mm-hmm.
That's done in an excellent manner.
Yeah.
If you can accomplish those three things, you've probably impacted somebody's quality of life for that day.
Mm.
Just that simple.
Yeah.
And but also that large, right? Because you think about it, you made someone's day,
Mm-hmm.
better, happier.
Yeah.
So what can be more fulfilling than that?
No, it's a great point, and I think it's easy to get so myopic that you don't always see that, and I feel it's important for a leader to not only uncover that, but then sort of consistently show up and remind people of that, and help people, I guess, celebrate the impact of their work, right? Meaning you might think what you do is small, but it's part of what you just talked about. And how do you kind of instill that culture where leaders really start to recognize and lift people up to see that they are contributing to making people feel happier, better, safer, whatever it is?
Well, one of the things we did at TABC was I quickly realized there was no leadership development program within the organization. So you weren't
Mm-hmm.
building a bench of future leaders. And so we worked with another state agency to survey the employees to identify the characteristics they wanted to see in
Mm-hmm.
their leaders.
Yeah.
Then developed a program to train our mid-level supervisors on those characteristics.
Mm.
Then had them hold themselves accountable to achieving those characteristics. So you start shaping the organization because you focus them on what the employees want to see in the people they work with.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're bringing up an interesting point about just the ability to build a team that really connects to the work and how important that is, and how I, I don't know what your experience has been, but I sort of look back at my career and I think there are times where we did not pay enough attention to that, meaning the hiring process was sort of formulaic, and it was like we didn't think. It was like, I have a job that I need somebody to do, and I'm looking for somebody who has those skills, as opposed to zooming out, like you just talked about, and thinking about how are we creating a team that supports the point of the whole organization, and how have you been able to bring that perspective in your own journey, and how do you think others can do it?
Well, a lot of it, I've been blessed to be a part of the organizations that I have.
Yeah.
In the Texas Army National Guard, people have been there 35, 40 years.
Yeah.
Which speaks a lot for the culture of the organization. Same thing when I went to TABC, we had literally generations of employees, people who had their father or mother had worked there. And so when you have that kind of situation, the organization has some glue, right? They have some family ties. They're not like Lee to come in and be gone in 3 years. Although some people did, but the majority didn't. And so the same thing, when you come into an organization like a county and they say, well, we lose most of our employees about 7 to 10 years. And I'm like, well, why is that? What is the issue? What's causing them to leave? Because it's more than just money. People will stay in an environment they're comfortable with for less money. Yeah. Often. The money's their one factor. Yeah. But they often find that where they went to for that money wasn't worth it.
Yeah, lots of times. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, the distinction between an organization with that glue you talk about, because there's a fair amount of consistency in the people. And, I come from, I would say, the exact opposite. So I worked in the advertising industry for 25 years, and the average turnover rate usually is somewhere around a third per year. So you're losing your whole company in 3 years. And, I know that's not your area of experience, but I'm curious, like, if somebody, appointed you to kind of come in and think about that challenge, through the lens of your own experience, what might be one or two things you would be looking at right away?
Well, I'd be wondering if they did exit interviews. Did we collect data points on why people left? Yeah. Because you're costing the organization lots of money, right? Because you bring somebody in, you train them, get them up to speed, and then they're leaving. Yeah. Costs you more money to go out and find somebody, bring them in, and go through the system. Yeah. So what is the reason they're leaving? Yeah. Is it more money? Well, you could probably afford to pay someone more money as opposed to have to go out and recruit and do all that process again. Alternatively, how are you working to build that team cohesiveness? Yeah. So if somebody doesn't want to leave, are you identifying bad managers? Are there people that are running people off? They don't care or invest in their people, and that will be demonstrated in the employee behavior. One of those is to leave. Yeah. So, you have to first identify where the challenge is. Is it with your leaders? Can you make them be better leaders for your employees? Yeah. Is it a salary issue, or is it something completely different? I would probably look at those three things and then look at team building. How do I build a better team within this organization?
Yeah, I think all of those would be worthy efforts in that space for sure. And I imagine others that have similar turnover, because I think, particularly when I think about the leadership and the training, it's not great in that world. And the team building it's tricky, right? Because it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg, right? Because people are turning over so quickly. It's almost like, what's the point of team building? Because I've like 30 out of 100 of those folks are going to be gone in a year. So it becomes this weird little tension point that at some point you have to address, obviously, but it's amazing to me how infrequently it gets addressed, and it becomes just the accepted norm that, okay, this is the cost of doing business, as opposed to seeing the potential benefits of if we had a more cohesive team, if we had better trained leaders, we could actually do better work and serve our clients better. I think you never even get to that point because people are just accepting it, Yeah.
Well, and I think that's one of your biggest challenges in any organization, because when you accept a level of accountability and performance,
Mm-hmm.
and you stop trying,
Yeah.
you stop trying to improve.
Mm-hmm.
Stop trying to prove your organization's not going to change. And that's a challenge in any organization. People get comfortable, and so why do I want to risk my job by trying something different?
Mm-hmm.
And it's only where you encourage change, or you encourage people to take calculated risk. You don't want people to take foolish risk,
Yeah.
calculated risk, and they're rewarded for it, then they will respond accordingly.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I think we could use more of that in the advertising world for sure. Um, you've mentioned the Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission that you work for, and you in the book, I believe you touch on that when you arrived, it was dealing with some scandal. Can you elaborate on what the scandal was, and how did you manage to kind of move through it and get to a place where things are working the way you want them to?
Well, the previous director had taken some staff on a conference trip to Hawaii
Okay.
that was frowned upon, and she got called on the carpet and eventually was forced to retire.
Okay.
It was unfortunate. I don't think, from my perspective, it wasn't very fair to her, but
Mm-hmm.
it didn't matter.
Yeah.
So, the governor and the commissioners asked me to help restore the public trust in the agency
Mm-hmm.
because of this, and some of the challenges they've had with industry players. There was just not a lot of confidence in the leadership of the agency.
Mm-hmm.
So with that, I had almost a clean slate to go in and make changes and move the organization in the direction I thought it needed to go.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first things we started doing was I met with the original 13 directors and realized very quickly that span of control or management was over my head.
Mm.
Bring in some deputies and elevate a deputy so that organization would be split up, and the three deputies would report to me,
Mm-hmm.
because in my mind, you need to be able to spend an hour a week with your direct reports,
Mm-hmm.
and more time with your indirect reports, either on a weekly or every other week basis.
Mm-hmm.
After a while, all your time gets eaten up and you're not really being effective if
Yeah.
you have too many people you're trying to do that with.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not able to spend that time with them, how are you truly working to develop them? And
Mm-hmm.
understanding what their challenges are. So I was able to restructure the organization. And then we start getting out and meeting with the employees of the agency, because we had 689 employees in 48 offices across the state of Texas.
Mm-hmm.
When I got there, one of my deputies or one of my directors said he had not been able to be out of the office there in Austin in 5 years.
Hmm.
And I thought, well, how do you know what's going on out there? Well, they reported to me. Well,
Mm.
yeah, but if you don't actually see what's going on, how do you know what they're telling you is the truth? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So we went around, and I had my deputies also go, and they visited with their particular folks out in the regional offices.
Mm-hmm.
And then I shared my vision of what I thought we could accomplish at the agency, but
Mm-hmm.
could only accomplish it with everybody's help. Yeah,
Yeah.
because you can't really move the needle without people getting buy-in.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing, we started meeting with groups of stakeholders and discuss their experiences with their agencies, with the agency, what they expected out of the agency, and how we could collaboratively work to make it better.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How long did that process take to where you felt like the public trust was restored.
Yeah, I think it's a continual process, to be honest
Yeah.
with you. I don't think you ever really obtain it.
Yeah.
I can tell you the metrics, so when I started at TABC, it was taking us about 85 to 89 days to approve somebody's permit to get into the alcohol beverage sales business in Texas.
Okay.
When I left there, uh, about 2 months later, I consulted with a business trying to get a permit, and they were able to get it within 48 hours.
Wow.
So a big difference, not only for the industry, but for the state, because obviously they get business, they start paying taxes and all the hiring people and doing all the good things that you want them to do. So part of that was historical investment by the legislature in technology for the agency, but also changing the attitude or the culture within the agency.
Yeah. That work to restore public trust, which I can see translating to sort of public trust and customer trust in a more corporate environment. How does that have any parallels to restoring trust within the organization? I mean, I can imagine even where you stepped into TABC that the organization might have just felt a little fractured. They've got probably different perspectives on the previous director's actions, and some people maybe thought she was unfairly treated, and others were like, maybe less so. Is the path to internal trust in an organization similar from your perspective?
I think so. At TABC, we had a very different organization because you had a bifurcated organization. You had 250 law enforcement officers plus a civilian agency. So they had very different cultures, very different ways of doing business, and managing the two of them was a bit of a challenge. But we needed to build that cohesiveness between the two of them in order to affect it. And we worked hard at doing that. One of them was the leadership qualities. So we had all the leaders go through that, law enforcement and civilian. So they sat in the same room and talked about those issues and learned a lot about each other and about what each other did that they may not or maybe not truly appreciated.
That's a really important point. I feel like in corporate environments, there's a lot of that going on where you make a lot of assumptions about what the other departments are doing, and you can even feel like the other departments are in your way or at odds with what you're trying to accomplish, and simply putting people in a room together and giving them a chance to actually talk outside of trying to get things done. Because I think that's the big distinction I hear, that when you're trying to get things done, you can start to see everyone around you as obstacles to you getting things done, as opposed to, oh, you're actually very similar to me. The things you want are broadly the same. You're just approaching it from your area of expertise versus mine. And suddenly that opens up a lot, I would imagine. Yeah.
Well, they're waiting on something from you, which what they need to accomplish. And do you really appreciate that? You don't understand why they get so frustrated because something's not done.
Yeah. You wrote a chapter in your book called Tea with the Taliban, and it describes, the idea of negotiating in hostile territory. Now, I know we're not often experiencing things at that level for most of us, but I imagine there were some lessons there that you learned. What lessons came out of your experiences there, and how do they apply to the broader world of work for most of us?
Well, I think understanding or trying to understand the different perspectives that people have. So one of the techniques we learned when I went through the University of Foreign Military Cultural Studies was the 4 ways of seeing. So how do you see yourself? How do you think other people see you? How do the other people see themselves? And how do you think you see them? So 4 different perspectives.
Yeah.
But only 2 people, right? So if you're sitting down with a group of people, have you thought about how they see you?
Yeah.
And, what about how they see themselves? Because when you start to look at things from their perspective, you can sometimes breach common ground
Mm-hmm.
easier than if you only look at from yours.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah, that the context there of, imagining that in a, an enemy environment. I mean, it feels like an emotionally big ask to say, like, look at that person who is your enemy or somebody that you're against, and actually try to imagine how they see themselves, and think about how you're seeing them. Like, it feels like you're asking for some generosity that I might not want to bring. And so how do you get how do you help people see the value in that?
Well, part of it is through demonstrating the exercise. Have people go through the exercise and talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
But for the biggest challenge sometimes, certainly of American military service members, is looking at the issue from our partners' perspective.
Yeah.
Whether it be Iraqi military,
Mm-hmm.
NATO member, everything. Because we had I can remember sitting down with a British officer and basically saying, "Well, we're glad y'all finally joined us in fighting terrorism. We've been doing it with the IRA since the 80s."
Mm.
Yeah. And you're like, really? Wow. And really thought about that. But yeah, it's a bit of a different perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, how does how does leadership show up in the most stressful environments? I have to imagine, I don't know all about all of your experience in the military, but I think certainly the broad picture we have is that there can be intensely stressful experiences there. And how do you find a way to maintain your your leadership qualities and traits in that environment? And are there shifts that you need to make because you're in that environment? And what does that look like?
Well, I think a lot of times you fall back on your training or um, experiences, right? So you've
Mm-hmm.
gone through something, whether it be at that intensity level or not.
Yeah.
Military training model is very simple, crawl, walk, run.
Mm-hmm.
Gone through similar exercises. This is just more intense. And so
Mm-hmm.
back on that training or that experience, and then what leadership tools and techniques did you use that were successful?
Mm.
So,
Yeah. Is there an experience where you come from having seen stress at its highest levels, and you get into civilian work, and what constitutes stress? Does it ever feel like that's not stress? What are you talking about? Or how do you sort of uh, embrace the context in that perspective?
well, I mean, nobody's shooting at you, but then
Yeah.
you know who the enemy is because they shot at you.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but being a head of a state agency with a legislature in session is very stressful because you're on call and you don't know why they're calling you down and what
Hmm.
they're trying to use your testimony or information for. And
Yeah.
also make sure you get the funding that your agency needs in order to do the next 2 years worth of budget.
Mm.
Uh, so it's intellectually challenging. Of course, going through COVID was a very stressful time
Yeah.
for everybody. And,
Hmm.
stressful from the governor's office and stressful from you trying to do the right thing, trying to enforce the orders of the governor, yet also understanding the impact on the industry. Because I often told my employees, without the industry, there's no point for our agency.
Mm.
So you need to understand what we're here for. Yeah, we're here to regulate the industry, but we're also here to make sure they stay in business.
Mm. Yeah. That's an interesting tension, I would think, right? To have like both of those truths in front of you. How do you navigate that?
Well, for the most part, most people in the alcohol beverage industry just want to understand what the rules are so they can follow them and make a living and go about their lives.
Yeah.
There are some bad actors that want to, try everything they can to twist, bend the rules in order to have an unfair advantage or to make more money. But those are few and far between. Most of
Yeah.
the people, once you get, they know what the rules are, they're happy to comply with them
Mm-hmm.
or try to legislature and change them,
Yeah.
which I'm fine with either way, quite frankly, because we don't make we didn't make the rules, the
Right.
legislature. So
Mm-hmm.
all we did was try to implement them.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Yeah.
think that perspective is important, you know, to keep. And what if you were that customer, that business owner trying to, comply with this very complex set of rules
Mm-hmm.
and just trying to run a business with all those challenges also.
Yeah. I feel like there is a perspective out there um, that you'll hear sometimes, and this is with almost any relationship between a regulatory body and a industry. I think you hear it a lot around like pharmaceuticals and things like that. That tension that you are there both to sort of enforce the rules, but also the industry itself has worthiness of existing and provides benefit to people, that some people feel like that's almost an impossible ask, like that you can't possibly both be supporting the ongoing nature of an industry as also while also telling it what to do. um, what's your take on that, and um, do you think there's any truth to that?
Um, I tend not to approach it from that perspective. To me,
Yeah.
you're just providing the left and right guardrails
Mm-hmm.
and then simply making sure that industry members are aware of it. And
Mm-hmm.
when they violate it, you notify them and then try to get them back into compliance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because there's public safety benefits to alcohol beverage businesses being in compliance.
Mm-hmm.
We literally found where we would see if we had a problem retail location where they were over serving people, not following the rules, if we could get them back into compliance
Mm-hmm.
or out of business, we'd find a 70% drop off in local law enforcement calls to the area.
Wow.
So there's advantages to that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So of course, we'd prefer they be in compliance. But
Yeah.
if they don't want to be in compliance, then your job as a regulator, make it difficult on them enough that they decide to not continue in that business.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. That's a that's a lot of responsibility, I imagine, to be aware of all that and try to manage that.
Well, it's challenging.
Yeah. I can imagine. And speaking of something that's a massive challenge, and I'm curious how you kind of got into this space, but there part of what you've done over the years, I think this is while you were with TABC, you got involved in some techniques that helped uh, stop or at least influence the world of human trafficking. How did that come about? And I understand that some of those approaches that you helped bring about are now being utilized in many other states. How did that whole thing come about, and what got you involved in that?
Well, the governor and our chairman asked if we could do something to impact human trafficking in Texas. Texas, the second most reported human trafficking state in the United States. So
Mm,
not a reputation that they wanted.
yeah.
And it does seem to be connected in certain ways with retail alcohol sales. So
Mm,
unfortunately, we didn't get any more money to do it.
mm,
So how do we do it with the resources we currently have? And so
yeah.
if you're not given more resources, then how do you leverage other resources? And
Hmm.
so my thought was, how do we create better eyes and ears out there?
Hmm.
So we can get reported locations that need to be investigated. So we came upon the idea of beer truck drivers. How do we get the beer truck drivers to be able to communicate with us and tell us what they see, if they see evidence of human trafficking? Because beer truck drivers are unique. They go in all hours of the day and night making deliveries, sometimes with simply they're given a key to go in and
Mm.
there. So they're almost unseen,
Yeah.
right? Because it's so a prevalent part of that industry.
Mm.
So we had our guys develop training. We go out at 5:45 a.m. before they made their runs and give them training on what human trafficking looked like in a retail location. And
Hmm.
so the response, and we set up a mechanism for them to report it to us. The response was overwhelming, quite frankly. It jumped, and I don't remember whether it was 70% or 700%, but it was a tremendous number of reports coming into the agency that caused its own problems. Because now I'm like, well, how do we filter through those complaints? We don't have the capability to investigate all those.
Mm.
So we created collaborative partnerships with local and state and federal law enforcement to get them engaged in helping us to investigate these.
Mm. Wow.
So
Mm.
it was really a positive response, I think made a dramatic impact.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds amazing. It sounds like a really good example of, you know, stepping into leadership in a really impressive way. And, I'm curious, as you mentioned that, what is the connection with the retail alcohol establishments? How is that influencing human trafficking?
Well, there were some bars that were literally doing it on premise,
Really?
or they were doing it on, uh, excuse me, off premises, but facilitating it. And
Mm.
so we would send in undercover agents and try to determine whether or not the manager or the ownership was involved in the process.
Mm. Wow.
So, and then we would work with um, state and federal law enforcement to try to rescue the girls and get them out into a safe environment where we could um, process them and get them the social services that they need.
Yeah. Mm. Wow. Yeah, it's amazing how much goes on in the world that you can be blind to when you're not involved in stuff. I mean, obviously, we're all aware of human trafficking, but the ins and outs of how it works is um, really interesting and sort of scary to hear about. Another big thing that I've been noticing recently is um, there's a lot of talk about foreign policy and stuff going on kind of in the political realm, but just more broadly, like we're very aware of the world in a way that maybe years ago you weren't as much because of social media, because of persistent 24/7 media. And I'm curious, like, and this is tangentially related to work, but it's like I feel like some of us are carrying some of this stuff, the weight of the worries of what's going on in the world so heavily that it probably does impact how we show up in work and in our relationships. And because you have this perspective of having been in the military and understanding some of that at a deeper level, what do you think is the right or an optimal way of carrying that reality that there's crazy stuff happening in the world without it just, I mean, I can't imagine sort of being in the worlds that you've been in and not being overwhelmed by that, but we still even feel overwhelmed as civilians, you know?
Well, yeah, I think all those are potential data points,
Mm-hmm.
obviously affecting.
Yeah.
You have to learn to filter some of that out.
Mm-hmm.
It's not relevant to what you're doing or what your life is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important, step away from the TV, turn off your social media, take a break from some of that. Yeah, because
Yeah.
just like anything else, it, maintenance of any machine, you have to maintain your mind
Mm,
and spirit. And if you don't take time to do that, eventually it'll break down.
yeah. Yeah. That's a great piece of advice to think of our minds as a machine and that it requires ongoing care, maintenance, support. Um, your book, you get a lot to leadership, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. We've covered some of it here. If there was sort of one thing that a person could do right now to make work better for themselves or for their team if they have it, what would be that first step you'd recommend for people?
I'd probably assess where you're at, what's going on in your organization or your work life, and what would you like to see improved?
Mm,
Because
yeah.
that's kind of the starting point is doing an assessment of what it is and then figure out what do you want it to be so you can figure out how to get there.
Hmm. What's the one thing you've learned about yourself over the years, um, throughout your work that had the biggest impact?
You don't have to know it all, and you
Mm,
probably don't. So if listen to those people around you, listen to the people that have worked in the industry, understand what their challenges are so that you can better figure out how to help get to that excellence.
mm,
You may not know the path. When I started when we started the program for beer truck drivers, my deputy thought I was crazy. He's like, why would they ever do this?
yeah.
Well, the industry and the regulator had a common interest. We wanted those bad actors out of our industry.
Hmm.
They actually jumped on board and they carried the torch much more than the agency because they wanted to be a part of the solution.
Mm. That that insight and that idea to come up with the beer truckers idea. I come from a world where creativity is really valued. You're coming up with ideas to help, create TV commercials and things like that. And I think there's a perception sometimes that places like the military or government or agencies like that creativity is not a part of it. But you just described to me something that seems very creative. Like you were tasked with a problem and you thought, what is with zero resources and how do I find a way to solve this problem? And I'm curious in all your years working military and government and any the civilian stuff, like what is the best way to encourage people to find that creativity in themselves?
Well, I think you have to think about, one of the biggest challenges I think you have is group think, right?
Mm,
Uh,
mm-hmm,
Military is that way, and organizations it's that way. The military, you think about it, you have these guys who've all grown up very similar careers, similar schools,
mm-hmm.
taught to think a certain way.
Yeah,
So they know what works for them in those organizations, and that size organization just gets bigger.
yeah.
So how do you challenge them to think differently?
Mm-hmm,
That can be a real challenge, and you have to be careful not to create a group of dissidents.
mm-hmm.
Simply critical without finding solutions.
Yeah.
But if you can ask questions and ask them in the appropriate way, they're smart people. You
Mm-hmm.
can lead people to change.
Yeah.
You have to be careful about, criticizing.
Mm,
Better to ask the questions so that they start seeing the path that you're trying to take them down.
mm. I really like that approach, and it interestingly would be very useful in the advertising industry, which has I would say, a deep-rooted cynicism at times, which it comes from frustration, like any other organization, with things not working the way you want to, and then it results in a lot of criticism, some of which are very much warranted. But to your point, that criticism isn't helping anything. I mean, it's one thing to vent it, but then now what? What do we actually do? And uh, getting people to be more curious and thinking about those solutions and bringing that and saying, I don't think this works. What about this is very different than just kind of going, that sucks. That sucks all day long. You know?
Yeah, or simply, why are we doing it that way?
Yeah.
What are
Yeah.
the advantages and disadvantages? Are there other advantages we could accomplish by doing it this way?
Yeah. Mm,
Because, I mean, really, it's, and sometimes that's the questions you need to ask when you're assessing the organization.
yeah.
Why do you do that?
Yeah.
And there may
Yeah.
be a different reason, but people can't articulate it, and they simply say, "Well, that's the way we've always done it." That's probably not a good way of doing business.
Yeah. I feel like the story that you hear around that is like, I think there was, I talked to somebody who mentioned, that they became the boss of somebody and this person was sharing a report with them every week. And finally, like the boss was like, what am I supposed to do with this report? And they basically like backtracked it to like three generations of employees before that. It was like some person wanted it because it helped them.
Yeah.
But then it just became a part of the job that if I'm the assistant to this person, I give them this report. And that went on for years until finally somebody said, what? Why are we doing that? So I think that's a really useful question, particularly when there's some embedded, learning that's been kind of stuck in their organizations that can have some of that groupthink that you talk about. But I think any organization is susceptible to that.
Sure.
I've asked you a number of questions. I'd love to give you an opportunity to ask the audience a question. Do you have a question you would ask of them?
What do you like to see in your leaders? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If you can answer that question, then you can probably help start shaping the leaders that you want to have over you or your supervisor or become that leader.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, it's amazing how such a, straightforward question, I feel like most of us rarely ask that question. We just assume that what we're given is what we're given, and that's what a leader looks like, as opposed to saying, I have some influence in the matter, whether it's influencing asking for what I need or becoming that person. Either way. Yeah. I'd love to see what some people say about that. This is the Desuckify Work podcast. So I want to ask you a question about if you could, wave a magic wand and create a fully desuckified work world. What does that look like?
I think it is an organization where you're getting constant feedback from your customers, and that then helps you to build a better organization or a better service delivery model. So you get more fulfilled.
Yeah.
No one likes answering the same question 12 times a day. That's not fulfilling.
Yeah.
But if you can move up from that to answering challenging questions that you hadn't thought of, then yeah, that gives your employees better satisfaction in their job.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that. I like how you described it. The idea of the challenging questions, that I think that's what most people want at work, is to be given something challenging to work on, particularly when there's a sense that if I work on this, something's going to change. Like you said, there's the constant repetition of we keep trying to work on this and nothing changes. But if you're empowered enough to actually make the change, then that feels like a really nice space to be in. Yeah. One of the things I do on my show, which is a bit silly, but I invite people to do it every week, is I use a lot of sound effects on my show. If you've listened, you'll hear cat meows and other weird sounds. I'm a big cat guy, so I kind of go down that road. But I always invite the guests to bring in their own sound that I would put in the beginning of the show somewhere. So do you have a sound you're up for sharing with us here?
I'm more of a dog person and a horse person, so either one of those would probably be fine.
Yeah. Can you make one of those sounds?
Oh no, I don't. Not very effectively.
I'll give you a chance. Try a dog bark real quick.
Oh, oh.
I buy that. I buy that. I think that would get my cat looking around. They'd be wondering what's going on. So the last question I always want to ask is, you've got this wonderful book out. You're doing a lot of good stuff in the world. How can people connect to you online, find your book, all that good stuff?
So my book is on Amazon. It is on Audible and Kindle. So 3 mediums there. And you can find me online through Brazos County website.
Awesome. Awesome. Are you on LinkedIn at all, or is that?
I am on LinkedIn.
Okay. And just to give people again the title of the book.
So it is Creating Excellence, Insights into Leadership, Life, and Legacy.
I like that subtitle, legacy. That's a big word that I think, certainly as some of us get a little up there in years, we start to think about a little more. So I love that that's a piece of what you're bringing in there.
Well, ideally, what you don't want to do is create something that ends as soon as you leave the organization.
Yeah.
You want buy-in from your employees so that it will perpetuate in some form. They get better once you're no longer there. Otherwise, you've only had a minimal impact.
Yeah. That's a great perspective. Well, Bentley, I appreciate this conversation. I appreciate you. And thanks for coming on and sharing your perspective about leadership and some of your other experiences.
Great. Thanks for having me. Enjoy it.
Yeah, thank you. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in to the Desuckify Work podcast. And a huge thanks to Bentley for bringing integrity and inspiration to the show. You can follow Bentley on LinkedIn and check out his book, Creating Excellence, Insights for Leaders and Their Legacy, on Amazon. If you enjoyed the conversation and would like to dive deep into some of your own challenges at work, I invite you to schedule a free half-hour discovery session where we can explore new desuckified possibilities for your future. Bye, everyone.